Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flemmer. This is our second episode on the dependence response to the problem of freedom and foreknowledge. Our guest is Philip Swenson.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Philip Swenson, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the College of William and Mary. Philip has written on several topics that will be of interest to our listeners, including Frankfurt cases, moral luck, and many more topics. He's a contributor to the recently revised Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on incompatibilist, non-deterministic theories of free will. And he wrote an excellent paper on the topic of today's episode called Ability, Foreknowledge, and Explanatory Dependence, published in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy in 2016. And we'll talk about some of that material today. Welcome to the show, Philip. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on free will?
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here. I'm a associate professor at William and Mary in Virginia, and I work on free will, ethics, and philosophy of religion mainly, but I love all sorts of philosophy. I got into thinking about free will probably mainly because of sort of theological reasons. You know, before I even started doing philosophy, I got interested in free will because I was encountering these sort of theological determinist views where God could determine you to do something bad and then still blame you for it or punish you for it. And these views, relied on compatibilism, and I didn't like that. I didn't like the idea of God determining me to do a bad thing and blaming me for it. So I kind of got interested in free will partly because I wanted to argue against compatibilism. The other main interest that pushed me to care about free will is I'm interested in the problem of evil. And you might think that views about free will have a big implication on whether there are good responses to the problem of evil and things like that. So those were my two ways into the problem, but to thinking about free will. But now I just like thinking about it in general, find it to be a fascinating topic.
Yeah,
Nice.
That's a common theme for a lot of our guests.
Makes sense.
In our previous episode, we talked with Trenton Merricks about his version of the dependence response to the problem of divine foreknowledge and free will. And there's some overlap between your view and his view. But in your recent paper that Taylor mentioned already, Ability, Foreknowledge, and Explanatory Dependence, you appeal specifically to the notion of explanatory dependence. So could you say what you mean by explanatory dependence and maybe give a few examples?
Yeah, great. So there's different senses of dependence that philosophers talk about. So one sense is counterfactual dependence, where one thing depends on the other because it would only happen if the other thing had happened, right? So, but that's not what I mean by explanatory dependence, right? So, for example, suppose I only go on suppose I always go for a walk on nice days. Well, then it's true that if I hadn't gone for a walk, it wouldn't have been a nice day, right? So it being a nice day counterfactually depends on me going for a walk. But me going for a walk doesn't explain why it's a nice day. So what you want for what we're after with this notion of explanatory dependence is explaining why or making so, right? Something explanatorily depends on something else if the second thing makes the first thing so or explains why the first thing happens. Philosophers give different kinds of examples here. So one example would be Sam is ill or 2 + 2 is 5 because Sam is ill. So why is the disjunctive statement Sam is ill or 2 + 2 is 5 true? It's not true because 2 + 2 is 5 because it isn't. It's true because the simpler thing, Sam is ill, is true. Another example, philosophers like to talk about sets of things, right? So in addition to my existing and Taylor existing, the set of Philip and Taylor exists, right? And philosophers tend to think that the set Philip and Taylor, if Philip and Taylor depends on Philip and depends on Taylor. So it's explained by Philip and Taylor. Why does the set of these two things exist? because the two individual things exist. Another example is causation. So I include causation as a type of explanatory dependence, right? So if John dies because you stab him in the heart, well, his death is explained by explanatorily depends on your stabbing him in the heart. So my notion of explanatory dependence is generic. It includes causation, which, like the case of you stabbing John, it also includes what metaphysical dependence or grounding, which is the set's example, right? So the set of Philip and Taylor is grounded by Philip and Taylor. And so it also includes multiple more specific types of dependence. So it's a sort of generic notion of dependence. Anything that's truly a making so, I count as a type of explanatory dependence.
Nice. So they're helpful examples. In your view, God's past beliefs about future free actions are explanatorily dependent on those free actions being performed. Could you explain how the idea that God's beliefs explanatorily depend on our actions is meant to undermine the threat to freedom from divine foreknowledge?
Good, yeah. So there's this threat of like, well, look, God knew 1,000 years ago that I was going to raise my hand. Well, how could I be free to do otherwise than raise my hand if God already knew what I was going to do? And I think the intuition that underwrites that is what's called the fixity of the past, right? The past is fixed. You can't do anything about the past now. So any past fact, any facts about the past need to be held fixed in determining what you can do, right? I can't do anything incompatible with the way the past is. I think that's really plausible unless the past depends on the future. So if it's really true that God's past beliefs are what they are because of my choice to raise my hand, then I think the fixity of the past becomes less plausible. So, imagine God's peeking ahead and watching what I do in the future, and he sees me raise my hand. And that's why he believes 1,000 years ago that I'll raise my hand. Well, then I think I can do something incompatible with the past, right? Because God's belief depends on what I do, well, he would have just believed something different if I had done something different. So I actually do have control over the past. So I think the existence of a God who can see the future is kind of like the existence of a time machine in that it gives you the ability to control the past, which normally you wouldn't have the ability to do. So imagine you believe, whether this is really possible or not, imagine you believe you're sitting in a working time machine, right? And you believe if you hit the green go button in the machine, it will send you back to 5 years ago. I think in that case, you would think you had control over the past. You would think it's up to me whether it's true that 5 years ago I suddenly appear in the past or not, right? So the fixity of the past stops seeming true once you come to think that the past depends on or is explained by your choices now. So I think the way in which God's beliefs depending on us helps get out of the problem is that it makes the fixity of the past stop seeming true. It starts to seem true that you could control the past. Why? Because the past depends on what you do today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've talked to people about backwards causation on this show before. So it seems like there's something weird going on when you're like, oh yeah, so maybe backwards causation is possible. Like, are you okay with that?
Yeah, good. So notice I was in my answer to your last question, I was just assuming there is this backwards dependence, and then saying if there was such a thing, it would solve the problem. But there's this question you might wonder, well, that's really weird. How could it be that God's peeking ahead, or how could it be that what I do explains something that happens in the past? So one answer would be backward causation, and I don't really hate that answer. You have sort of a perceptual account of God's knowledge. Maybe the future stuff is backwards causing God's beliefs. But here's an answer that doesn't require backwards causation and instead has a different type of backward dependence. So philosophers talk about something called truth making, right? So certain things are made true by events in the world, right? So why is it true that I raised my hand? Because I raised my hand, right? So you, instead of backwards causation, you might have backwards truth making. So why is it true that so go back to 1,000 years ago? Why is it true that 1,000 years from now, Philip will raise his hand? Because he raises his hand in the future. So what runs backwards, the dependence relation that runs backwards might be truth making, right? I raise my hand. That makes it true 1,000 years ago that I will raise my hand. And then once it's true back there in the past, maybe there's a causal story of how God sees those truths, but there's some way that God can see these truths that are true back then. So you don't have any backwards causation. You just have backwards truth making. So that's another, I don't know which is the best model of how the backwards dependence works, but if you really don't like backward causation, there are other ways to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, when we talked to Trenton Merricks about his view, it seemed like he didn't like the idea of backward causation and went more for the truth maker model. But I think there's even if you're going for that model, there's a slight difference between your views. Did you want to say something about that, about whether, God's beliefs depend on it's like being true that you will do something, or the fact that you will do something versus the choice itself?
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, Merrick's, the dependence claim he appeals to is God believes that I will raise my hand because I will raise my hand. And I think in order to get free will, you need something a little bit stronger than that. You need God believes I will raise my hand because of my action of raising my hand. So it's important to me that the action that God's belief depends on my actual choice, not just on it being the case that I will do it, but my actual choice itself. So that's one way we might differ a little bit.
So what are some of the implications for your view for other philosophical and theological commitments? I guess we've already seen one about like facts about causation that you might affirm or not affirm. But another example, like what difference would this make for your view of divine providence?
Yeah, good. So have you guys covered open theism on the show before?
It's coming up in a few episodes.
Okay, yeah. So
it's true that in the future we will cover open theism.
In our introductory episode, Simon Kettle talked a little bit about open theism, but we haven't had a whole episode on it. Yeah.
I think this view will allow you to get more providential control for God than open theism does. So on open theism, God can know the probabilities that things will happen, but he can't know for sure. And I think this sort of dependence view gets you more providential control than that. So David Hunt has a really nice example where God is playing paper, rock, scissors against the devil. And on open theism, if the devil's freely deciding whether to throw scissors, rock, or paper, God might lose sometimes, right? But if God can sort of peek ahead and see what the devil decides to throw, he can make sure he never loses. He can see, the devil threw scissors, so I'm going to throw rock. So I think that example shows, and is exactly right. It shows that this kind of view gets you more providential control than open theism. I don't think so. I think so. You guys talked about Molinism on a previous episode I saw. I don't think this view fits that well with Molinism because I think this view together with Molinism generates explanatory circles, and I'm not a fan of explanatory circles. So on Molinism, God knows ahead of time what you would do in various circumstances, and he decides what circumstances to put you in on the basis of that knowledge. So he might know if Philip were in his office, he would raise his hand. I really want him to raise his hand, so I'll put him in his office at that time to make sure he raises his hand. So in order for my action to be free on the dependence view, it needs to be the case that the fact that I would raise my hand together with God's decision to put me in the circumstance depends on my actual raising of my hand, right? So why is it true that I would raise my hand? Well, because I did raise my hand. But then on Molinism, we can ask, well, why did I raise my hand? Isn't it in part because God put me in the situation where I would raise my hand? So it looks like we have an explanatory loop. My raising my hand explains why it's true that I would raise my hand. And it being true that I would raise my hand explains why God puts me in the situation. And that explains in part why I raise my hand.
Yeah.
So I think you get an explanatory loop. And if you instead denied that it's true that I would raise my hand because of my actual choice to raise my hand, then I think you won't get free will, because then it being true that I would raise my hand plus God's preference that he to put me in a situation where I would raise my hand together entail that I raise my hand, and those facts don't depend on my choice to raise my hand. So I think we would have to hold those facts fixed in determining what I could do, and I wouldn't have free will anymore. So I guess I think you can't get the kind of providential control Molinists want if you don't like explanatory loops. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Another thing I think about providence is that I think this view gets you a little bit more providential control than Ockhamism. So Ockhamism involves saying there are certain facts that are not purely about the past; they're related to the future in such a way that we don't need to hold them fixed, right? So the fact that the Berlin Wall fell so many years before we had this conversation. Well, that's partly about the past, but that's partly kind of partly about now, right? So it's not a pure fact about the past. So they distinguish between the hard facts about the past and the soft facts about the past. So a natural thought you might have on Ockhamism is that we have to hold fixed the hard facts, and you can't do anything incompatible with the hard facts about the past. But on this view, on this dependence view, you can do something such that the hard past would have been different, right? And so I think that gives God a little bit more providential control consistent with our freedom. So Alvin Flanagan has this example of, I think it's Paul in the ant colony.
Yeah.
So God wants to preserve a certain colony of ants. So if Paul was going to mow his lawn, if God saw that Paul was going to mow his lawn, he wouldn't have allowed the ants to move into the yard. But as it turns out, Paul doesn't mow, so God allows the ants to move into the yard. Here's a hard fact about the past: the ants were in the yard, and it seems like it's true that if Paul decided to mow today, then the ants wouldn't have been in the yard this morning, right? Or yesterday, right? So you have a hard fact about the past. The ants were in the yard that would have been different if Paul had acted differently. So the dependence view makes more sense of this. You can see why on the dependence view, we don't hold fixed that the ants were in the yard. Why? Because the ants being in the yard depends on Paul's choice. The reason the ants were in the yard is because Paul will decide tomorrow not to mow, right? And so it makes sense on the dependence view not to hold fixed that the ants were in the yard. But on Ockhamism, well, the ants were in the yard looks like a hard fact about the past. So it doesn't really make sense not to hold that fact fixed. So God has more control, more ability to save the ants, consistent with Paul having free will on the dependence view than he does on Ockhamism.
So we could say, maybe just summing up the idea, is Ockham was partly right, that there are past facts that we can do something now that they would have been different, but he didn't go far enough. And it's like, well, maybe there's just not any hard facts at all. Maybe all facts are soft facts in the past.
Right. Yeah. Or maybe we shouldn't have been caring about this hard fact, soft fact distinction, where that's captured in terms of which facts seem like they're specially related to the future in a way that other facts aren't. Really, the only sense of specially related to the future that we should have cared about is do they depend on the future?
Yeah.
And if we switch to that model, we'll have more providential control.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Well, let's turn to some objections. And I think you can handle this first one kind of quickly because we've just been talking about it. But we asked Trenton Merrick's about two objections to the dependence view. One, that it's really just a version of Ockhamism. And the other is about whether the dependence view sort of requires just assuming that we have free will, which may seem inappropriate in the context of considering this challenge to free will from divine foreknowledge. So did you want to say anything more about the first objection about Ockhamism, or do you have any thoughts about this second one either?
Yeah, so on the first one, it doesn't bother me if people want to call this a version of Ockhamism.
Mm-hmm.
The way I kind of think about Ockhamism is it was concerned with two things. It was concerned with facts that are related to the future in a special way, like the Berlin Wall fell so many years before this conversation, seems to be related to the future in a way that the ants were in the yard isn't related to the future. So it was concerned with that, and it was also concerned with dependence. And the thought was, well, only these facts that are related to the future in a certain way really depend on the future. And I think we should question that second thought, right? And say, no, maybe other facts can depend on the future too. But if somebody wants to say, well, aren't you still kind of doing something similar enough to Ockhamism that we should count it as a version of Ockhamism? That wouldn't bother me.
Yeah.
I just like this way of thinking about it, whatever you want to call it. On your second objection, I'm not sure if I'm properly understanding the objection, but it's the thought like, well, I say you don't hold it fixed if it depends on your choice. So I'm assuming that you have a free choice, but that's kind of a problematic assumption when we're trying to figure out if you had a free choice.
Yeah,
is that kind of
yeah.
Andrew Law had said something to me about this that I think was helpful. And his thought was, well, maybe you can just go off of, you can say what you need is for it to depend on the way a particular indeterministic event turns out. And we don't have to assume that indeterministic event is a free choice. We'll conclude that it's a free choice after we do our analysis. So it's causally undetermined whether I raise my hand or not. Does the past depend on how that indeterministic event turns out? If it does, well, then we don't need to hold fixed that past event in determining whether it's a free choice now. That seems attractive to me because I do see the worry about begging the question there.
Yeah. Yeah, that sort of fits with the way that I've talked to Andrew about this too. Like in one paper, we put it in terms of like, you should think of divine foreknowledge as not introducing any new or special challenge to free will that wasn't already there. So it's not like you have to assume that we do have free will. It's just the dependence response is trying to show that if you weren't already worried about free will, this is no new reason to think we don't have free will or something like that.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Another objection comes from Patrick Todd, who argues that the dependence view has some implausible implications for a case of divine pre-punishment. You're familiar with this objection? Could you explain it and tell us how you respond to it?
Yeah, good. So imagine that God sees that in 10 days Taylor is going to do something wrong, or perform a wrong action. So he says, well, I'll just punish him now. I'll put him in jail. So Taylor sits in jail for 10 days, and then he gets let out, and he's about to decide whether or not to do this wrong action that God saw that he did. And imagine we say to Taylor, you have a choice about whether you just spent 10 days in jail or not, because you can just decide not to do that wrong action. And if you decide not to do it, well, then God wouldn't have put you in jail, and you wouldn't have just spent 10 days in jail. So you have a choice about that. On the dependence view seems to have that line of thinking make sense, because on the dependence view, God's choice to put Taylor in jail really does depend on Taylor's decision to do the wrong action now. And that seems absurd. It seems absurd for Taylor to think, oh, yeah, decide not to do it, and I won't have just spent 10 days in jail. I think there's three oddities of this case that might explain why it seems absurd that don't apply to God knowing the future in general. So that would be my response, that this case is weird and odd and maybe impossible for reasons that don't have to do with God knowing the future in general. So the first oddity is that uh, you might think Taylor's reason for deciding not to, if he decides not to do the wrong action, his reason will be, I just spent 10 days in jail and I didn't like that. Um, but that would be an impossible reason for him to act on in a world where he doesn't spend the 10 days in jail, right? So we might have some kind of incoherence in his reason, what would naturally be his reason for acting, and the world he would be in if he performed the action. The second is you might worry about explanatory circularity here, right? So you might think, well, look, Taylor being in jail is going to explain why he decides not to do the wrong action. It'd be very weird if that had no causal impact on his decision, given that he remembers the 10 days in jail and finds it unpleasant. So it'll have some kind of causal impact on his decision, right? But then his decision will explain God's punishment of him, and then God's punishment of him will also play a causal role in his decision, right? Spending 10 days in jail is the kind of thing that affects your psychology and will probably affect the decisions you make after spending 10 days in jail. So you may get an explanatory circle there. And the third thing is that since Taylor knows he was in jail, he already knows that he's going to do the wrong action. And you might think there's something very odd about deliberating and deciding whether you're going to perform an action when you already know that you're going to perform the action, right? You might think it's impossible to really deliberate or freely choose when you already know what you're going to do. So I think those are three things that are odd about this case that wouldn't be odd about a case where, God pre-punishes Taylor, but Taylor does not know about it. Or God just believes that Taylor is going to do the wrong action, and Taylor doesn't know that God believes that. So I think we won't get, we can say, yes, Todd, you're right. There's something very weird about this case, but we don't have to accept that case is possible. We can think it's absurd, but not think God knowing the future in general is absurd.
Yeah.
So whether there's an ant colony in Paul's yard depends on whether he mows or not. Whether the ant colony was in Paul's yard, the previous day, that seems like a hard fact by the Occamist distinction about the past, and so it seems puzzling on their view how to make sense of Paul's freedom. What if? And I think these cases sometimes come up as a challenge for the Boethian view and also for the Occamist view. What if God looks into the future, he sees what's going to happen, and then he inscribes in a tablet a prophecy about what will happen? It seems like the Occamist has to treat the prophetic object as part of the hard past, but maybe on your view it would be like the ant colony, where even though it's not just that there are ants here, it's that there's this object prophesying what's going to happen. You might still think it's not the kind of thing we have to hold fixed,
right?
Unless maybe you read it or something, right?
Yeah, if you read it, then some of the worries I brought up for the Todd case come back up here, okay. Right? But if you didn't read it and nobody knew about it, then you might have control over whether that prophetic object says what it says, right? Or something else. I think so. I agree that that's a nice worry for the Occamist view is, well, even if God's belief is a soft fact, couldn't he write it down on a stone? And the fact that he wrote it on a stone sure seems like a hard.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about cases where these are cases I think that have come up in earlier episodes of the podcast where there's a prophecy that's told to someone. Do you think could you I think I know what you're going to say because of what you said in response to the pre-punishment case, but suppose Jesus tells Peter he's going to deny him 3 times. What do you think about that kind of prophecy that's told to someone?
I have a lot of trouble making sense of Peter being free in that case, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it does seem like the kind of thing that would lead to an explanatory loop, right? That's Jesus telling him that is surely going to, you'd think, would affect his psychology.
Mm-hmm.
It's also, in that case, maybe he doesn't believe Jesus. So maybe we don't get the problem if he already knows what he's going to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We would at least get the explanatory loop problem. So yeah, so I mean, maybe I could say that the only way those kind of cases are possible if God is just super careful with the causal chain so as to avoid story loops.
Yeah.
Or maybe you'd have to just say, in some of these cases, the agent wasn't free. But I regard that as a cost if you have to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the narrative now in the story, and it almost comes across like Peter wasn't thinking about it until the cock crowed, and then
Right.
all of a sudden he's like, "Oh crap!" Like I remember what Jesus just said, and it came true.
Yeah. So maybe God made him forget just so he wouldn't.
Yeah, who knows?
Divine freedom or something.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got another question that I asked Trenton Merricks, and I want to ask you too. So, some people might have a problem with the dependence view, maybe because they have a really high view of God. I don't know whether you want to call it aseity, or sometimes it might be like classical theism, where God is not dependent on things in the way that the dependence response requires that God to be dependent, or God's knowledge to be dependent.
Yeah, I agree.
Is that a worry for you that we're making like God is not as independent of creation as he would be?
Yeah, so I agree that there does seem like a prima facie tension there. But the people who like these sort of views that make God like very independent of everything often like surprisingly think these types of things will fit together, even though I don't understand why they will fit together. So they might still think God could make an indeterministic world and know what was going on in that world without being dependent on it in some way, right? And I would say, well, I just don't understand that, but maybe I don't understand metaphysics or something. But yeah, I guess I've never been very attracted to those kind of views of God, where God is like so high above us that he's not, watching us or paying attention in ways that would make him dependent, or he doesn't have emotional reactions based on what we do and things that would make him dependent on us. But I agree. There's definitely a puzzle there for someone who wants that really high view of God and wants to accept a dependence type account to explain how they fit together.
All right, one more question for you, Philip, and it's based on a case of time travel. But it's also kind of based on the case of pre-punishment too. It's parallel to that. So we talked with Andrew Law about this kind of case. Imagine that there's a working time machine in the room, but it has a lock on it. And so, Philip, you seem to know a lot of things, and I come over and I ask you for the combination to the lock on the time machine, and you deliberate about whether to give me the correct code or whether to deceive me. And you deliberate about it for a while, and then you decide, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to tell the truth. I then use the information you've given to me to unlock the time machine, get in. I go back in time a few minutes, and I come back to the same area. I keep my distance because I've watched enough science fiction to worry about running into my younger self. But I keep some distance. I'm in the bushes with some binoculars, and I watch this conversation unfold where I come up to you and I ask you for the code to the lock on the time machine. And as I look over there, I see you're thinking about it. You're deliberating about what to do, and I think, oh no, what if he doesn't tell me the truth? What if he lies to me? Then I won't get the information. And also I won't be able to travel back in time to be here. And as I think about it, I think, okay, so my knowledge that he's going to tell the truth depends on his telling the truth. And yet it really seems like he can't avoid telling me the truth. He can't lie to me, because then I wouldn't be here to like be watching and thinking about this in the first place. So what do you think about that kind of case? Do you see it as a problem for the dependence view?
Yeah, that's a really nice case. One thing I might say is when you have that intuition, when you have that thought, well, he can't not tell the truth because I'm here.
Mm-hmm.
One sense of can't there might just mean it's epistemically impossible, right? So
Right.
you just really know for sure that he's going to tell the truth, because you wouldn't be able to get back to watch
Mm-hmm.
if he didn't tell the truth, right? So maybe there's like instead of a metaphysical impossibility, like he agentially can't, it's more that you're tracking like an epistemic impossibility, where you know, like we say, that can't be, when we're really sure that something is not the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're just really sure that he won't, and there's a sense of can't, that an epistemic sense of can't that
Right.
follows from that. But it's a good case. I feel the pull. I might be a little theory driven and just saying, oh, what's really going on there is you're just really sure that he won't do anything else, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have free will, or he
Mm-hmm.
isn't able to do anything else.
Yeah. That's good. Well, thanks so much for your time, Philip, and thanks for joining us. For listeners who want to see what other things you're working on, what you're writing, your other published papers, where can people go to find you online?
Yes, you could check out my website. If you just Google Philip Swenson philosophy, you'll find me. I have papers on free will and Frankfurt cases, moral luck, philosophy of religion, freedom, foreknowledge, stuff like that. Even have a paper on gun control. So I do a lot of different things.
Do a lot of different things. Yep.
Yeah.
You can also search me on YouTube. Search for me on YouTube. I've done a few other interviews, and I've even debated Taylor on the topic of foreknowledge, right? So
That's
definitely
right.
people should check that out on YouTube.
Cool.
But thanks so much. This was really, really a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thank you, Philip.
Yeah, thank you. In our next episode, we discuss a sourcehood libertarian response to the problem of freedom and foreknowledge, which our guest calls the Augustinian solution. And our guest will be David Hunt, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Whittier College.